Someone in the house across the street was watching me. I figured it out by the light. It turned on only when I stepped up to the window. I asked my neighbor who else lived with him. He smiled and said,
"I live alone."
That same night, I saw two shadows in his window. The next morning, I was told that no one was registered at that address except him. From that day on, no one believed me at all, not even myself.
Chapter 1. That evening, everything was the way it was supposed to be. I got home around 9, took off my shoes by the door, set a mug of coffee on the kitchen table, turned on the light in the living room. Outside, rain was falling, steady, quiet, the kind that makes you not want to go anywhere. Evenings like that don't bring surprises. They don't ask for attention. They just exist. I sat on the couch, scrolled through the news, muted the sound. This neighborhood had always been quiet. That was exactly why I chose it. No students, no bars, no late-night gas stations under the windows. The houses stood at equal distances from one another, like they'd been measured out with a ruler. Each had its own yard, its own curtains, its own life, one you're not supposed to look into. I didn't look, not until I noticed the light. The house across the street was just like mine. 2 stories, gray siding, a garage on the side. Nothing special. But one room on the 2nd floor always had the light on. Not bright, more muted, as if the bulb were old or covered with fabric. I registered it automatically, not with anxiety, not with interest, just noticed it. I finished my coffee, stood up, turned off the light in the living room. Passing by the window, I glanced at the house across the street again. The light was still on. I thought it was probably a child's room or a home office, someone working late, someone who didn't like the dark. I went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling thirsty, got up without turning on the lights, walked to the kitchen. While pouring water, I glanced at the window out of habit. The light in the room across the street was off. I felt nothing. It made sense. People go to sleep. I went back to bed and fell asleep again. In the morning, everything repeated itself. Coffee, shower, news without sound, an even ordinary day. The light was on again. That's when I realized I hadn't remembered the light itself. I'd remembered the moment it appeared. Not gradually, not the way a lamp is usually turned on. It had been off, and then it was suddenly brighter, as if someone had turned a dimmer to a specific setting. I frowned, then immediately distracted myself. Thoughts like that don't usually linger. Every house has its habits. A few days passed. I started noticing a pattern, not because I was looking for it, but because it gave me no choice but to notice. The light always turned on when I was in the room with the window. Not at the same time, not on a schedule, just when I looked. One evening, I stayed in the hallway on purpose. The light in the house across the street was off. I stood there, counting the seconds. Nothing happened. I took a step forward into the spot where the window was visible. The light turned on, not sharply, with a delay, as if someone inside wasn't reacting to movement, but to the fact of my presence. I said out loud, without knowing why, "Strange." A couple of seconds later, the light flickered, once, briefly. I froze. The room was quiet. The house was quiet too. I could hear only the refrigerator and my own breathing. The light didn't flicker again. It just stayed on, as if nothing had happened. I stood by the window for a while longer, even though I couldn't say why. The light didn't turn on. The house across the street looked ordinary again. Closed curtains, dark windows, no signs of life. I stepped away, lay down on the bed, turned my face toward the wall. I tried to force myself to think about anything else. Work, the next day, the idea that in neighborhoods like this, people simply live by a schedule. About 10 minutes later, I realized I couldn't hear the rain anymore. I opened my eyes. The silence wasn't complete. The house was making its usual sounds, but something was missing, as if one layer had been cut out of the background. I couldn't immediately tell which one, but the absence was clear, almost physical. I got up again, walked to the window. The light in the room across the street was on. I hadn't seen it turn on. I hadn't heard a switch. It was just there. I glanced at the clock. No more than 15 minutes had passed since the last time I'd seen that window dark. During that time, I hadn't gone near it. I hadn't looked in its direction. I stood still. The light didn't change. I took a step to the left, just far enough that the window almost slipped out of view. The light went out. I stepped back. It turned on again. No delay. This time, immediately. My heart started racing, not from fear, but from the effort my brain was making to find an explanation, and failing to find one that didn't feel forced. I raised my hand and slowly passed my palm in front of the glass, as if checking whether my reflection was still there. At that exact moment, the light grew brighter, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. I lowered my hand. I don't remember how long we stood there like that, me and that rectangle of light. At some point, I caught myself thinking that I didn't want to blink because I was afraid of missing the change, not the light itself, but the moment before it. When I finally stepped back, the light stayed on. I went back to bed, but I didn't try to sleep anymore. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the feeling to pass. It didn't. Before dawn, I looked out the window again. The light was off, but this time I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The curtains in that room were slightly parted, not enough for someone to look out, just enough for someone inside to see the street. And I knew for certain, the night before, they had been closed.
Chapter 2. The next day, I left the house earlier than usual, not because I was in a hurry. I just didn't want to stay inside any longer than necessary. The air was damp and cool. The sky hung low and gray, one of those mornings that doesn't leave a memory. I locked the door, checked the handle, and was about to walk to my car when I heard a voice.
Good morning.
It sounded too close. I turned around. A man was standing at the edge of his yard, the same house. He was wearing a jacket and jeans, holding a mug in his hand. Nothing unusual, about my age, maybe a little older. His face was calm, open, without tension. I nodded. Morning. We stood across from each other with the low fence between us. He didn't take a step forward, neither did I. The distance between us stayed exactly where it should be, between neighbors who aren't acquainted, but aren't strangers either.
You move in recently?
A couple of months ago.
Thought so.
He smiled. It was an ordinary smile, not too wide, not forced, the kind people use when a conversation doesn't really matter, but still needs to be carried on. I noticed his eyes kept drifting back to my window, not lingering, just checking. Quiet neighborhood.
Yeah, That's why we're here.
He took a sip from his mug. I glanced at his house without thinking. In daylight, it looked even more ordinary than it did at night. Same windows, same paint, same neatly drawn curtains, no trace of whatever happened there after dark. "Your light's on late sometimes," I said before I could stop myself. The sentence hung between us, too direct, too soon. He didn't seem surprised.
Really? Huh.
He didn't turn around, didn't look at the window. He just kept looking at me.
Probably one of us forgets to turn it off. That happens.
I waited for him to specify who he meant. He didn't. "Do you live alone?"
Yes, that's good. Makes things easier.
I didn't ask what exactly was easier. He smiled again, this time a little longer. There was no friendliness in it, no threat either. It looked like a reaction to a private thought he had no intention of sharing.
If anything ever bothers you, you can say something.
"What kind of things?"
Light, noise, habits.
He said the word habits slowly. I nodded, even though I didn't know why. He turned and walked back toward his house, unhurried. I watched him go and noticed something strange. Before stepping inside, he stopped on the porch and lifted his head, looking not at his own house, but at mine, at the exact window I usually watched from at night. Then the door closed. I got into my car, but I didn't start the engine right away. For a few seconds, I just sat there, staring ahead. The conversation had been short. There was nothing openly strange about it, and yet I had the clear feeling that I'd learned less than I was supposed to. That evening, when I got home, I didn't go to the window right away. I turned on the light, put the kettle on, walked around the room. The house was calm, familiar sounds, ordinary space. When I finally looked toward the house across the street, the light in that room was already on. And for the first time since all of this began, it seemed to me that it wasn't on because I was looking. It was on because it knew I would. Chapter 3. The first thing I noticed in the morning was the window. It was slightly open, not wide, just enough that it couldn't be blamed on a draft. I stopped in the middle of the room and stared at it the way you look at an object that isn't where it's supposed to be. I clearly remembered closing it the night before. It hadn't been automatic, not a habit. I had checked the latch, specifically because I'd stood by the glass for so long the night before and didn't want a repeat of that. I stepped closer, shut the window, turned the lock all the way. I did it slowly, carefully, as if explaining to myself that everything was back in place. An explanation immediately formed in my head. I could have been mistaken. I could have forgotten. I could have closed it improperly. All of those sounded reasonable. I accepted them the way you accept a small inconsistency, something not worth attention. But the feeling didn't go away. It wasn't fear, more like an irritating flaw in a system where everything else worked perfectly. I took a shower, got dressed, left the house. The day passed calmly. Work, conversations, familiar tasks. At one point, I even realized I was barely thinking about the house across the street. It felt like a victory. That evening, when I got back, I went straight to the bedroom. The window was closed. I stood there, looking at it, and for the first time since this started, I felt something close to relief, as if everything had finally returned to its proper place. I closed the curtains and didn't go near the window again. That night, I dreamed a dream without form, not a story, not images, just the sensation that I wasn't in the same place the whole time, as if there were gaps between moments of sleep, carefully cut out by someone. I woke up suddenly, for no reason. The room was dark, quiet. Everything looked the way it was supposed to. I rolled onto my side, and that's when I noticed the light under the door. I hadn't turned it on. The hallway was lit, dim even, without a source I could immediately identify. I sat up on the bed and listened. Silence, no footsteps, no movement of air. I stepped into the hallway. The light was there,
Not the ceiling light, not the wall fixtures. It came from a place where, during the day, there was nothing but empty space between doors. I walked forward, trying to understand where it was coming from, and at that moment, the light went out completely. I was left in darkness. I stood still, counting my breaths. No panic, just the need to regain control. I reached the switch and flipped it. Ordinary light flooded the hallway. Everything looked normal again. I went back to the bedroom and lay down, keeping the tension in my shoulders as if it could protect me from something I didn't yet understand. In the morning, I found a mug on the kitchen table. Clean, dry. I didn't remember taking it out. I stood there, staring at it, replaying the previous evening in my head. I knew I'd had tea. I knew I'd cleaned up after myself. The mug couldn't be there, not because it was impossible, but because I would have remembered it. I put it back in the cabinet and shut the door a little too hard. That day, I started keeping track of everything, not in a notebook, in my head. I noted the position of objects, the state of windows, switches, doors. I repeated it all before going to bed like a mantra. Windows closed, lights off, door locked. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check. For a while, everything matched. On the third day, I found a mark. It was barely visible, a dark streak on the floor near the window, as if someone had dragged a sole across it. Not dirt, not dust, just a disruption in the surface. I crouched down and ran my finger over it. The floor was clean. I stood up and looked at my shoes. The soles were clean. That evening, I didn't go near the window across the street. I didn't look. I didn't check. I wanted to know whether something would happen without my involvement. The light turned on by itself. I didn't see the moment it happened. It was just there when I happened to be in the room. I hadn't stopped by the window. I was just passing through. I froze. The light didn't change. I stepped back. It went out. And that's when I understood. It was no longer about whether I was looking. It was about where I was. The thought didn't bring panic. It brought something else, heavy, viscous, like being informed of a fact you can't dispute but aren't ready to accept. That night, I sat on the bed for a long time without lying down. I waited for something to happen or not happen, and that was the worst part of it. I was no longer sure I'd be able to tell the difference. Chapter 4. We met during the day, not in the evening, not at night. That alone felt wrong. I was leaving the house, heading to the store. The day was sunny and dry, the kind that makes it hard to believe anything bad could exist. I had already locked the door and taken a few steps down the path when I heard a familiar voice.
You're early today.
I didn't stop right away. It took a second to realize the remark was meant for me. He was standing by his fence, no mug, no jacket, just a simple shirt like he'd stepped outside for only a minute. His posture was relaxed, too relaxed for a chance encounter. Not working today?
Oh, then that makes sense.
I didn't know what exactly he thought made sense. We were standing at the same distance as last time, neither closer nor farther. It was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like a rule I hadn't been told about.
You're not sleeping well.
It wasn't a question. Something tightened inside me, not suddenly, slowly, like a belt being pulled one notch at a time. What makes you say that?
You can tell.
I looked at him more carefully. His face showed no concern, no curiosity. He spoke the way people talk about the weather or traffic, a fact that didn't require discussion.
Sometimes people start noticing things when they stop sleeping.
What kind of things? He smiled, but not at me.
The ones that used to not matter.
A pause settled between us. I caught myself waiting, not for words, but for confirmation of what I didn't know. But the feeling was familiar, the kind you have when you're waiting for a doctor to say a diagnosis you already understand.
Have you ever lost time?
The question came calmly, without pressure, without a trap. I didn't answer right away. What do you mean?
A few minutes, an hour, sometimes more? When the day seems to go on, but you can't remember what was in it.
I was looking at him, and I had to make an effort to hold his gaze. At some point, it felt like if I looked away, the conversation would end, or change. "No," I said, "I don't think so." He nodded, as if he'd heard the answer he was expecting.
That's normal. At first, no one does.
The word "at first" landed too clearly. I felt irritation, not fear, not panic, but irritation, the kind you feel towards someone who speaks in hints without having the right to. "If you're trying to say something," I said, "say it directly." He looked at me closely, longer than before. His eyes lingered on my face, then my neck, my hands, not assessing, more like verifying.
I already did, just not with the right words.
He turned, preparing to leave. "Wait!" He stopped, but didn't turn around. I hesitated, searching for the phrasing. "Have you noticed the light in that room?" He slowly turned his head.
Of course, we all have.
"All?"
Yes,
He paused.
just not everyone understands when it turns on.
A cold weight settled in my chest, not sharp, dense, like something heavy had been placed inside me. "And when is that?" I asked. He smiled again, this time almost sympathetically.
When you stop being sure you're where you think you are.
He walked away without saying goodbye. I stood there on the path, the sunlight suddenly feeling unreal, too bright, too even, like a set. I didn't go to the store. I went back inside the house, and the first thing I did was look out the window. The room across the street was dark. I stood there for a few minutes, then stepped away. And in that moment, without looking, I felt the light turn on. I didn't see it. I felt it. Chapter 5. It happened on a Saturday. I remember the day not because it was special, but because it was too ordinary. The morning passed quietly. I cleaned the house, went to the store, came back, put the groceries in the refrigerator. Nothing broke the familiar rhythm. I deliberately didn't look out the window. It had become a rule, not a decision, a rule. I wanted to see whether something would happen without my involvement, not a reaction, not a response, on its own. Closer to evening, I heard a sound, not loud, not sharp, just wrong. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the house across the street. I didn't immediately understand what I was hearing. It wasn't a voice, and not footsteps, not music, not an engine. Something in between, intermittent, as if air were being forced through an opening that was too narrow. I walked to the door and stepped onto the porch. There was a vehicle parked in front of the house across the street, a white van with no markings. The doors were open. Nearby stood two men in dark clothing. They didn't look like workers. They didn't look like police. Just people who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't consider it necessary to explain. I froze. One of them lifted his head and looked directly at me. Our eyes met for a second. There was no threat in his face, no surprise. He simply registered my presence, the same way you register the weather. I stepped back inside and closed the door. I don't know why I didn't start recording. My phone was in my pocket. The camera worked. That would have been logical, but in that moment, the idea of documenting it felt pointless, as if I already knew it wouldn't record. I went back to the living room and, for the first time all day, looked out the window. The room on the second floor was lit. The light was different, not steady. It pulsed, barely, but enough that it couldn't be dismissed as a faulty bulb. Something was happening inside the room, but I couldn't see movement, only changes in the light, like breathing that didn't belong to a body.
The sound grew louder. Now it was clearer. I realized it wasn't the noise of work. It sounded like a voice, distorted, as if it were being forced through walls. Not words, intonation, rhythm. I felt my palms turn cold. One of the men went inside the house across the street. The other stayed outside, leaning against the van. He wasn't watching the windows. He was watching the street, the way someone does when they're not monitoring what's happening, but who might see it. I stepped away from the window and stopped immediately. The light didn't go out. It kept pulsing, even though I wasn't looking at it anymore. I understood this not with my eyes, but with my body. The same way you sense an appliance running in a room, even when your back is turned. The sound suddenly cut off, abruptly, without fading. A few seconds later, the man came out of the house. The door closed behind him. They got into the van. The vehicle drove away without turning on its headlights until it reached the corner. The street became quiet again. I stood in the middle of the room without moving. My mind was empty. Not shock, not panic, but a lack of response, as if the system that processed information had temporarily shut down. After a minute, I walked back to the window. The room across the street was dark. I went outside, walked up to the fence, looked at the house from the street. Everything looked normal. No signs, no open doors, no people. The next day, I called the police. I described the van, the men, the sound, the light, the time, everything as precisely as I could. They listened carefully, asked questions, asked me to repeat myself. An hour later, they called back. There was no van, no vehicles recorded, no complaints from neighbors. The house across the street was occupied. No incidents reported. A voice on the line said it was possible I had mixed something up. I thanked them and hung up. That evening, I looked out the window again. The light was on, but now it was steady, calm, just like it had been on the very first night. And for the first time since all of this began, it became clear to me. What I saw happened only for me, and that was exactly why it never existed.
Chapter 6. They came in the morning. Not suddenly, not aggressively. 2 men and a woman, calm, polite. They didn't inspect the house, they inspected me. They spoke slowly, leaving pauses, as if making room for my agreement.
We just want to help.
I nodded. By then, I already understood what was expected of me. They didn't ask about the light. They didn't clarify the sound. They weren't interested in the van. They wanted to know something else. How I slept, how I felt, whether I experienced memory gaps, whether I felt anxious. I answered honestly. That was a mistake. A week later, they said I needed rest. 2 weeks later, they said my observations weren't being confirmed. A month later, they said my house was no longer considered safe to live in. The house across the street was taken down quickly. Not physically, on paper.
The documents stated the building had been declared unsafe long before I moved in, that the residents had been relocated, that no complaints had ever been recorded. The before and after photos looked convincing, too clean. I stared at them and felt a strange sense of relief, as if I'd finally been told that I was mistaken. Only I knew it wasn't them who were wrong. I left that neighborhood without arguments, without statements, without trying to prove anything. I no longer had a single argument I could say out loud without looking exactly the way they had already decided to see me. The new place was farther from the city, quieter, simpler. The first evening passed calmly.
I made myself some coffee, sat by the window. For a long time, I watched the street, the identical houses, the closed curtains. It felt like the move had finally smoothed something out inside me. I stood up to turn off the light. That's when I noticed it. The house across the street, second floor, a window. In one of the rooms, light was on. It wasn't bright, muted, the kind of light you get when a bulb is old or covered with fabric. I stood perfectly still. The light didn't change. I stepped closer to the window. It grew slightly brighter. I stepped back. It stayed on. I caught myself smiling, not from joy, from understanding. It was a feeling painfully familiar, like a scent you can never forget. I looked at the clock. The timing matched. I turned off the light in the room and sat in the dark, my eyes fixed on the window across the street. I wasn't waiting for a reaction. I already knew it would come, not because I was watching, but because I was here. A few seconds later, the light flickered, once, briefly, exactly the same way it had on the first night. I didn't do anything. I didn't record it. I didn't stand up. I didn't move closer. I just sat there, watching, letting the moment be what it had always been. That was when I understood the most important thing. This had never been a mistake, and it had never been unique. Not everyone stays long enough to notice. I finished the cold coffee and closed the curtains. The light behind them kept burning, and I knew if I walked up to the window tomorrow, it would be waiting.